Alright, so this part of our tutorial will be focusing on testing multiple conditions at once using one if statement or nested if statements. So the first part is going to look at testing two conditions in one if statement. So it's going to be using one if statement, and we're going to be using the AND and the OR operators to test two conditions simultaneously. And then we'll take a look at nested if statements, in which we'll have an if statement within an if statement that will only execute if the first if statement passes. But I'll explain more about that coming right up. Alright, so now you've seen basic if statements and you've seen kind of two in a row. We tested some booleans and had kind of like a true-false test thing going on, where we tested basically see if our answers were right. Now we'll take a look at testing two conditions in one if statement, as well as using what we'll call nested if statements, which is going to be an if statement inside an if statement. So we're going to be looking at, I'm just going to put this in a comment, we're going to take a look at two conditions within one if statement and nested if statements. Okay, so let's take a look at two conditions first. Now the way we do this is we basically set up our if statement as normal, but this time we're going to use the brackets and then the curly braces. So in the brackets we're going to have condition 1, and we're going to use the AND operator, and condition 2. And so we'll first look at using the AND operator and then the OR operator. Okay, so this is what it's kind of going to look like. This I guess I'll just put in, I'm not even going to bother putting this in a comment. Okay, so what we'll do is we'll think about the idea of an account of some sort where you have a username and a password. Okay, so we need both of these to match to be able to log in. So first we'll have to create a Boolean variable. So this is going to be variable, and we'll call this is logged in. This will be a type Boolean, and we're going to give this a value of false to start off with because we're not logged in yet. And then we'll have a username. So username, and this will be type string, and I'm just going to use my name, and we'll have some kind of a password, which will also be a string, and we're going to call this password. Okay, so not very creative, but please don't use the word password for any passwords that you're going to assign. Okay, it's not a good idea. Okay, so we're basically going to run this test to see if our username and password match, and if they do, then we'll change is logged in to true. So this is going to be a pretty common test that you'd see with kind of any account that requires a username and password. You obviously need both of them to match to be able to log in, and if they do match, then you can log in and then you can access the account. Okay, so we're going to set up our if statement, and remember this time we'll use the regular brackets, and I'm just going to set that up there. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to see if the username equals Nimish, and if it does, we're going to then test the second condition, and password equals password as a string. Okay, so if it does, then we're going to change is logged in to be true. Okay, and I guess we don't need that semicolon there. So, and well, there we go. We had true printed out right away. So just one thing to note is while you're in the playground, you can kind of rely on these values to appear here. So it will kind of automatically give you the value of, for example, this test. It kind of automatically runs this test, and if it's true, it prints out the result here. Okay, so this is only something you'll see in playground. When you're actually developing these apps that I'm sure you'll eventually go on to do, then you won't necessarily have this luxury, so you'll have to run tests and use if state or print statements and stuff like that to be able to see these values. But for now, then enjoy your playground experience. Okay, so before we've already kind of run it because it does it automatically, but I'll explain what's going on here. So we have the first test, just like we had in the if statement in the previous part of our tutorial. We're just testing one condition, again with the double equals here. So if username equals password, or if username equals Nimish, that's good. And then if password equals password, then that's also good. So if this condition passes, so if this condition works out to be true, then again we'll carry out this code, which is changing the isLoggedIn value. And so in this case, we have two conditions to test. In the previous one, we only had one condition. This time we have two. So both of these have to pass. Both the username test and the password test have to pass in order to execute this code. If one of these two is wrong, then nothing happens. So for example, let's say we have this changed to 1234 or something, which is also not a very good password, by the way, but it's a little better than password. So as you can see, isLoggedIn is not true anymore, and if we want to check, we can just kind of type in the isLoggedIn value here. I'm going to wait for it to run. And so yeah, in this particular instance, the username test passes, but the password test fails. So we have logged in as still being false, okay? So this is going to be any time that you try to get into an account and you enter at least one of these two fields wrong. So with the AND operator inside of an if statement, and this is the AND operator, if either one of the tests fails or both of them fail, then we won't execute this code here. If both of them pass, on the other hand, so if one out of those three conditions passes, then we can execute this code. The OR operator is a little different, and I'll show you what I mean. So we have the OR operator, which is these two vertical lines here. In this case, we only need one of these two tests to be true. Okay, this isn't very indicative of an account, because if only the username or the password was true, it wouldn't be very secure. So this is basically saying if either one of these two tests, if the username test passes, or the password test passes, or both of them pass, then we'll execute the code. So at least one of these needs to pass to execute it. The only time we would fail is if both of these were false. Okay, so I'm just going to keep the isLoggedIn printed here so we can see how it changes. So in this particular test, we're going to change this back to password. So this is true because both the username and password test pass. In this case, we have one of the two failing, but that's still okay. But in this case, let's say we had Mammoth, then isLoggedIn is false because both tests fail. Okay? So this is how to test two conditions in one if statement. So we can use the OR to see if either one or both are true, and we can use the AND, in which case the test will only pass if both are true. Okay? So that's how you test multiple ifs or multiple conditions in one if statement. And if you want, we only use two. You can chain these together so you can have as many different conditions as you want, but that gets a little more complicated. Okay? So again, that's how to test two conditions within one if statement. Now let's take a look at nested if statements. So what I mean by this is we'll have an if statement with some kind of a condition to test. I'm just going to put the braces here just for the time being. And then we'll have another if statement with another condition. Okay? So it will test the first condition and then it will test the second condition. The difference being that we can execute some code if one of the tests passes, but not the full code if both of them don't pass. Whereas in this case, if both of them didn't pass, we don't execute any code. So let's write up the same condition, but using the nested if statements. So if username equals Nimish, and I'm just going to change this back to the original values. So Nimish, and then this was password, our highly secure password. So if that's true, then we're going to execute this code. Oh, I wonder why it didn't include the other bracket there. That's okay. and then we'll run the second test if password equals password. And then we'll, I wonder why it stopped including those braces. That's interesting. Anyway, so this is saying if the username is Nimish, then we pass the first test and we can execute whatever code is here. And this one is if the password test also passes, then is logged in can be true. Okay, so I am just going to set this back to false for now. Okay, just to kind of reset it. And I'm just going to leave this code up here. I'm trying not to delete any of the code that I'm writing so that I have the source code for you guys to look at. So the difference between the nested ifs and the kind of two conditions in one is that this code can only execute if both tests pass right away. Whereas in this case, we could actually have some kind of other code, like we could create some variables, variable hello, string equals hello, and that's fine. So in this case, this code would execute regardless of whether or not this test failed. Okay, but this code inside of these two brackets here would only execute if both tests pass. Okay, so that's the biggest difference, is that using the nested if, we can still execute some code even if one of the tests fails. Okay, just be careful about where you put it. If I were to put this in here, then this code would only execute if both tests pass. But if I leave it outside, then it's fine and it will pass regardless of, it will execute regardless of the outcomes of this test. We only need this test to pass. Okay, so that's the difference between nested ifs. And I noticed that Google or Gmail kind of does this. So when it prompts you to log in, it kind of prompts you to enter your email first, and then you hit submit, and then it takes you to your password page. And that's something kind of like this. So we could have something like, I'm just going to put this in a comment because the code would be much more complicated. So we would have, if we'd have the email test pass, and then we would have redirect to password prompt, and then we'd have if the password passes, then we would have login to account. Okay, so that's an example. That's a difference between maybe Hotmail and Gmail that I've noticed, at least. When I go to log into Gmail, there's kind of two different steps, whereas in Hotmail it's all one step. So that's where the difference between a nested if and a two conditions in one if statement come in. So both do kind of similar things. In both cases there's two conditions to test. The difference being that the double conditional tests both right away, whereas the nested if tests first one, then the other. So you can execute some code in between those two tests. Okay, so that's the difference between the double condition and nested if statements. All right, so I think that's pretty much all we have to say on that matter. Just a simple recap. This time we're testing two conditions in one. With the AND operator, both tests, both this test and this test, have to pass in order to execute, whereas we saw with the OR operator, only one of the two or both of them have to pass in order to execute the code. With the nested if, we saw that we could do just one test and run the code here, and then perform the second test, and if both tests pass, we'll do this inner code here. If this test fails, we exit out of the if statement altogether and don't execute anything. But if this test fails, then we still execute this code. Okay, so that's the difference between the two. Next time we'll be looking at else if statements. Okay, so this part took a look at testing multiple conditions at once using if statements. So we first looked at the testing two conditions in one if statement. We used the AND and the OR operator, and in this case we only had the code within the curly braces executing if both those two tests passed, because we tested two conditions at once. So if both of them passed using the AND operator, then we executed the code. Whereas with the if statement, or the nested if statements, it gives you the option of kind of running the code between the two tests. So we test first one test, and then we can execute some code, then we can test the second test. And that kind of allows us to, again, run a little more of the code based on only one test rather than two at once. So we use the example of logging into an account. And I noticed when I logged into my Hotmail account, I had to enter both username and password correctly at once. So that's kind of like two conditions in one. Whereas with Gmail, I had to first enter my username correctly, then it prompted me to enter my password. So that's kind of like the nested ifs, where the first condition's testing if the username is correctly, then it redirects you to the password prompt, and then if you enter your password properly, then you get into your account. Okay, so think of some other examples where we'd see double conditions versus nested ifs, and this next part will focus on else if statements.